We shall now move to part 3, which is the post-independence years. This period is from the 1960s to the 1990s, and it corresponds with a period of time when the second-gen artists slowly come into prominence and replacing the first generation. A simple definition of the second generation is that they were students of the first generation, and most of them were actually students. Only a few are self-taught, for example, Lim Tze Peng. And most of the second generation, they were born between the late 1930s to early 50s. And therefore, it means that they are now around 80 years old. And unfortunately, a few of them have already left us. And this is why it is important to capture them right now, to interview them and to know more about them before they pass away. And many of these second-gen artists, they also attended NAFA. A handful of them were trained under the Chinese Ing artists. For example, Fan Changqian, like Chua Ek Kay is a student of Fan Changqian. And for the second generation artists, most of them, their artistic direction follows a East blend West strategy. We shall now look into the conditions in which the second gen grew up, and this would have implication on their life. You can see here a photo of Clifford Pier in the 1950s. We know that in the 1950s, the population of Singapore is only 1 million. And you can see from the photo that there is no financial centers. All you see is sea around Clifford Pier. So in those days, there were not much of economic activity. And this is a photo of the kampong houses in Jalan Kayu. So a substantial part of the population is not actually living in the city. Those that stay in the city, most of them were living in very poor and cramped condition. And those living outside the city were also living in a very poor condition. And in the 50s, it was a time where Singapore started urbanization. So you can see that the government started to build a lot of HDB flats, and the second-gen artists in the 50s, they are maybe in their teens or they just starting out in life, would have moved from poor housing to a better housing at that time. Another aspect of Singapore in the 1950s is the pro-communist student riots. For example, in 1956, there was a big student protest against the Lim Yew Hock government, and this later turned out to be something like a riot and cost 13 lives. So, due to the general political climate, many of the second gen who are Chinese-speaking lean to the Soviet social realism artistic idea. And they didn't get this idea through direct Soviet sources, but rather they get it from the Chinese influence. Another group of artists followed the Western free world art styles, embracing movements like the Paris School and abstract art. Example, the Nanyang artists and some younger second generation artists. And some of them formed the Modern Art Society. In the 1960s, there were heated debates in the art scene over the purpose of art. One faction, represented by the Equator Art Society, advocated social realism, while the other faction, represented by the Modern Art Society, advocated the so-called progressive art, saying realism is old-fashioned and out of date. I once did an interview with Wong Kim when I was doing my thesis, and I asked him, why did your parents allow you to go overseas just like that? And he said, my parents don't care what I do, so long as I have something to do. Finding a job is difficult, and it is unimaginable to have options such as lawyer, doctor, architect. So at that time, they really don't care. Another experience I have with Ong Kim Seng is that he told me that in the beginning, he didn't even know that paintings can sell. There's no such concept at all. Therefore, the second generation, they didn't have the luxury of good material wealth, and they struggled in their earlier years. Ironically, the poverty and the ignorance actually push them to pursue their dreams in art. Because, for example, today, if you are a young artist, you will have many options and you'll be weighing the pros and cons of pursuing an art career. Thus, in the beginning, for the second gen artists, they approach art in a very purist, innocent way, and they did not consider monetary awards. And at that time, we must also remember there wasn't things like internet and not many books, and there were no museums. So for the second gen to get in contact with the rest of the world, or even to look at good art, it is very difficult. Some of them went overseas to study, and some of the popular destinations are London, Paris, and New York. Despite of the economic difficulty, many of them actually made it to overseas education. For example, Lim Yu Kwan went to UK, and Yo Ho Kun went to Paris. And for New York, we have Wong Kin and Go Bing Kwan. Now, how many second-gen artists were there? Well, there are 50 over artists. You may find these numbers a bit surprising. Is this number a lot? I have an experience when I go to Yogyakarta, the so-called art capital in Indonesia. I was led by a guide and I asked her, what is the population of Yogyakarta? She replied me, there is 1 million people there. And I asked her, how many artists you have? She told me that, oh, we have 10,000 artists in Yogyakarta. So actually 50 artists is not too many. These 50 artists that I mentioned here are artists who are somewhat active, and you can somewhat see their artworks in galleries, auctions, or bigger scale exhibitions. There are many semi-amateur artists out there. So now I provide you a map of the second generation. It is classified into 4 categories. The first 3 categories, watercolor, Chinese ink, flash calligraphy, canvas realist, impressionism. This comes from the earlier classification that I have provided you about the early driving forces of the Singapore art. So these 3 categories comes from that vein. The last one, I named them New Age/others. This group is because some of the artists having gained overseas experience, they start to deviate from the traditional arts. So for the second generation, the 70s and 80s, our Singapore society was still not very affluent. There was somewhat an art market back then, but it was very small. And also most of the Singapore collectors at that time focused on Indonesian and Chinese art. So to make a living for the second gen artists was also very difficult. So there are galleries like Della Butcher who promoted Singapore artists. Many people refer her as the mother of Singapore art because through her gallery, she promoted many artists and helped these artists through their very difficult earlier years in the 70s and 80s. There were also other galleries like Alpha Gallery, which is actually set up by artists themselves. Now, in this difficult situation, only a handful of artists survived through the ages. In the 80s, the art market was more vibrant and there were more artists in the 80s. But by the 90s, somehow the art scene took a turn and many artists gave up their career. For example, we have a very talented watercolorist, Hua Chai Yong, and we lost him during that time. Basically, he stopped painting. And it was only around 2011 onwards that the art market got interested in Singapore artists again. So again, here there is some questions for you to answer to help you revive your memory. Now we are going to zoom in into the various artists to look at them in a little bit of more details. So we start with watercolor artists. The first artist that I want to introduce to you is Gog Sing Hooi. Gog Sing Hooi is one of the founders of the Singapore Watercolor Society, and he was born in 1933, which is quite early for the second generation. Therefore, many of the second-gen watercolor artists look at him somewhat like a senior, although they are considered the same generation. And because he passed on quite early, we do not know much about him. And in fact, only those people who are very into Singapore art knew about his existence. For me, he is very important because he developed a very fine style that seems to have influenced the whole second-gen artists. And he is most famous for Singapore river scenes. Here is an example of his Singapore scene at the Singapore River, and you can see that he is able to portray the subject matter in a very detailed way. Do you remember that I introduced to you the British watercolor style? Think about the differences. And think about, during Lim Cheng Ho's time, he was doing the British watercolor style. And in fact, we are able to see early Gog Sing Hooi also painting in the British watercolor style. But sometime in the late 70s and 80s, this new style emerged. And we look at this example of the Singapore River. And you will notice a stark similarity between a few water artists, including Puay Hua, Leng Joon Wong, Ong Kim Seng. They all somewhat painted in this style. And even the brown hue is as if they are all painting in the same style. I ever posed this question to Ong Kim Seng, whether Gog Sing Hooi was their leader. But Ong Kim Seng said that they developed the style together. So I find this very interesting. Here is another example of his work. And if you know watercolor, you will know that this is very difficult because of the hooks you see in the picture. In watercolor, it is easy to portray a large wash, but to get these fine lines, it is very tough. The next artist we are going to introduce is Ong Kim Seng. Ong Kim Seng is without doubt the king among the second generation watercolor artists. Now, why do I say that? This is because he has many different styles. For example, Gog Sing Hooi may be as good as him, but Gog Sing Hooi sort of only have one or two types of styles, whereas Ong Kim Seng, he has many different styles. So Ong Kim Seng was the president of the Singapore Watercolor Society for many years, and he's now the honorary president, but he came at the period after Gog Sing Hooi. And Ong Kim Seng is a Singapore Cultural Medallion winner. One of Ong Kim Seng's great achievement is that he was the first Asian to win the prestigious American Watercolor Society Dolphin Fellowship. Now, you may ask what it is. The American Watercolor Society is the most prestigious watercolor society in the world. And every year, they have a traveling exhibition. They would call out to the artists in the whole world to submit their artworks for selection. So in a typical year, they would get about 2,000 or 3,000 submissions, and they will choose about 100 pieces for their traveling exhibition. In order to qualify for what we call the signature membership, meaning that you can sign AWS in your artwork, you have to be selected into the exhibition 3 times. During each exhibition, they will choose a small number of works to be given awards. And if you win the award one time, you score 1 point. In order to get the Dolphin Fellowship, you have to get awards 5 times, meaning that you have to first get selected, and then you must win the awards. So it's very, very difficult. So today, Ong Kim Seng has already got 9 awards. And you can imagine how highly regarded he is in the international watercolor scene. So today, he is often invited to watercolors activities all over the world as a judge. For Ong Kim Seng, his style, he is characterized by the strong play of light and shade. And I think that is the most characteristic feature of his art. And he often says that watercolors are poems and oils are novels. What do we mean by here? What he's trying to say is watercolor is good at capturing some fleeting moments, and it is not watercolor's strength to have detailed renderings, although it is possible and he did it in a splendid way. So he has series like the Kathmandu series that is really very, very intricate. At the same time, he is also able to do very fluid, watery style. And another of his characteristic is he is able to capture forms very accurately. For example, I have many experience painting with him because I'm his student. And every time, for example, he goes to paint the Singapore Shenton skyline, he could just paint it off watercolor without the need for help for eraser or whatever. He could just directly sketch out the entire scene, which is very difficult. Because if you had experience with sketches, you know that with so many buildings, you have to take care of the relative sizes and things like that. So it would really take a very good skill to be able to do it in one shot. So here is an example of the Kathmandu series. You can find that he is able to do intricate brushworks. For example, you look at the bricks. And for all his awards in the American Watercolor Society, they are all coming from this Kathmandu series. This is another intricate example. You can look at the leaves, but when you look at the reflection, it is portrayed in a very lively manner, and you can feel the reflection. So in this painting, he has 2 types of techniques. One is the detailed, and the other one is the water wash. Even the walls are depicted in a very detailed way. When you look at this painting, what time of the day do you think it is? Is it noontime, early in the morning, or evening time? So this painting gives you a feeling of a very strong sunlight. But how does he achieve that? Can you find places that are purely white? Some may tell me that the pillars are white. But if you look carefully, it is not really pure white. What is the reason for doing this? Or what is the reason for achieving this? This is what Ong Kim Seng called the black cat, white cat theory. What it means is that you must have a strong contrast between the light and the dark areas. So if you look at the alleyway behind the pillars of the right building, you find that it is extremely dark. And this will create a contrast to make the light areas seem very white. And if you look at the center below of the painting, where the store is, you find that there is a red and the orange cloth hanging. And there is a white patch which signifies a person there. So that was left intentionally. So amongst an area of black, there is this white coming out. And that's why this painting is so interesting. Now, this is the very accurate form that I was talking about. He could just sit there and he could sketch this out without much alteration. Because we are so familiar with this scene, we sort of subconsciously know that what is the relative size between each building. So if you have a building that's too fat, too long, you will find that it's very odd. But Ong Kim Seng has that ability to sketch them all out very accurately. This is one example of what we call the wet in wet techniques. So basically it is using very watery brush and apply the colors. This seems to be quite effortless, but actually it is not, because you literally cannot control the flow of water. So you need a very highly skilled application so as to control exactly how much the water or the paint would smudge out. Now, this is a recent style that he has developed, is Californian watercolor style. The Californian style is characterized by flat areas or flat colors. And one of the characteristics is there is this very contrasting color schemes. And if you look carefully, this is different from nature, which means that to compose this painting, he has to think of the color scheme out of nothing. Because for the usual kind of plain air watercolor, you can just record what you see and make a little bit of alteration. But for this, you have to start all over again and think about your own color scheme. This is sort of his latest developed style, just this year during the circuit breaker. During the circuit breaker, many artists had more time to concentrate on their art and many produced good works. Such paintings need a lot of work and take perhaps 4 to 5 times the amount of time than the usual watercolor. Ong Kim Seng called this style ultra-realism. He said that he needs to move on with times and compete with top watercolor artists around the world. He related that he was having events with other watercolor artists overseas, and he noticed that even the younger artists are doing in a different style. So he said he want to compete with them. Hua Chai Yong is a special watercolor artist because, unlike the rest, he developed a style which he called the flat brush. His paintings were all constructed with rectangular depths of colors, created with a rectangular shaped brush. He was highly talented, and during the 1960s, he was painting with the Equator Art Society, and by the mid-60s to early 70s, his paintings had already become matured. Unfortunately, he was unable to turn into a full-time artist, instead choosing to live a humble life as an employee of People's Association. He stopped painting completely in the 1990s. After 2011, the art market got interested in Singapore modern art again, and he held a few successful sell-out shows. He was pricing his works in the 1980s prices, so collectors felt that they were very good value for money, and of course, his works are very attractive. This is an example of his works in 1970s. His earlier work are darker in color scheme. This is a work from the 1980s. I call it his matured style. By this period, his palette becomes brighter. In my opinion, Hua Chai Yong was a tragedy for Singapore because in the earlier years, he showed great promise in terms of talent. But due to the Singapore environment, he didn't really have an opportunity to fully develop his talents. We need to avoid such a scenario for future younger artists. We will now move to the Chinese ink section. It is worthwhile to take note that most of the second-gen artists, even though they are practicing Chinese ink, they no longer do the traditional Chinese ink styles. This is because the style has gone out of fashion. Lim Tze Peng is currently the hottest living Singapore artist, and some say he is already a household name. For him, he led a long life. He was born in around, some say 1921, some say 1923. He achieved his first artistic peak in around the 1980s, where he worked very hard to document the fast-changing Singapore landscape, because at that time Singapore is going through urbanization. And in 2005 to 2006, he changed his style to a more bold and free and abstract style. And during that period, he invented the mother calligraphy style. In Chinese, we say the Hu Tu Zi. In 2012, a work by Lim Tze Peng sold for about 120k Sing dollars in Christie's Hong Kong. This event made headlines because it was the first time that a second-gen artist went past 100k Singapore dollar mark in public auctions. So this is an example of his early 1970s work before his first pick. If you compare this painting with the next slide, you'll find that this painting, it captures the form, the general feel of the place, but in terms of the detailing and complexity of the ink wash, it is not so rich. So this is the early style in the 70s. Here we have an example from the 1980s, and this is what I call his first pick. You will find that the detailing of the various things in the picture is really amazing. And this kind of works is hotly chased after by collectors. By the time he reached 2005, he is already 80 over years old and he is unable to do plein air painting like before. His eyesight is failing, so he finds it very difficult to do his previous detailed style. And so he did a lot of soul searching and experiments, and finally he reached this style which is more bold, more abstract, and in a way we can call it ink gestures. What he's trying to do here is to create a sense of motion, energy, and maybe a sense of grandeur for the big works. Some of these works can reach even like 3 meters or 5 meters in size. This is a very physically very taxing task for a person who is 80 or even 90 over years old. This is an example of a Singapore river in around 2010. He painted these paintings using old paintings as a point of reference, no longer painting on site. And actually, in this kind of painting, the subject matter is no longer that important because what he's trying to show is things like the movement of the brush, to feel the boldness and the strength in the brush strokes and the grandeur and things like that, abstract concepts, whereas the subject matter itself is no longer so important. The painting thus becomes a medium in which the artist can express all those abstract concepts that I have just talked about. And for the artist, it is not so much about the subject matter. However, from the buyer's perspective, most people are looking at the subject matter. But the subject matter isn't really the core purpose of the works from this period. This is an example of what we call the mother calligraphy. He invented this soon after 0506, the switch in the style. For this particular piece, it is one of the earliest mother calligraphy he did. And this is actually taking 2 pieces of calligraphy and joined together to form one piece. The mother calligraphy actually looks like a calligraphy, but actually it contains no words. What it does is that it actually gives Tze Peng a whole new avenue of expression because mother calligraphy allows him to take himself away from those constraints that is entailed to him by the traditional calligraphy. And there is no need to actually write words because when you want to write meaningful sentences, you have to follow a certain form because it's Chinese words. But with mother calligraphy, he can twist and turn and do whatever he likes with the so-called characters. And with this, he later on evolving into putting colors in different ways. And it has gone into a huge body of works. The next artist we would like to introduce is Chua Ek Kay. Unfortunately, he has also left us. Chua Ek Kay started his artistic journey as a student of Fan Changqian. So in the earlier years, Chua Ek Kay was doing very traditional Shanghai school style of Chinese painting. I have the fortune to know him when he was much younger in the 80s. And I could see that already in those days, he was trying very hard to move away from the traditional works. And sometime when he was in his late 30s, he quit his full-time job and went in as a full-time artist. And he was all along trying to find a more contemporary style. By 2000s, he managed to come out with a more matured style, which is clean, sleek, and very contemporary in feel. And it is a great hit with Singapore collectors. But unfortunately, he died quite young, at about 60 years old, in 2008, and therefore he didn't have time to produce too many artworks, because during the 2000s to 2008, he received many huge commissions from institutions and he spent a lot of energy working with them. Here you see an early example in 1993 when he was trying to find his new voice. This is a painting of a lotus. And here is a street scenes dated around the 2000s. You see that it is a matured work, which is very captivating and something that has not been done before. This is an example of what we call the Taoge series. Taoge means bean sprouts. And it appeared somewhat later in his career, maybe the mid-2000s. So it's an abstract rendition of lotuses. So you can find that it gives you a completely new feeling with respect to the traditional works. Next, I will introduce to you an artist by the name of Chuan Keng Boon. Chuan Keng Boon has achieved high artistic standards, but he passed on before he could become famous. He is essentially a traditionalist, so quite different from Ek Kay or Lim Tze Peng. But of course, he is also trying to find a new style, and if he could have lived longer, he could have come out with something new. And he is most skilled in the practice of ink landscapes. This is his traditional works. You find that it is in the vein of the Bata Sanren kind of painting. Bata Sanren is a very important Chinese artist who lived around end of the Ming Dynasty, sometime around 1644. So in this case, he's depicting an owl and having a very forlorn face. Mr. Chuan is an immigration officer who works in Woodlands checkpoint, and he is usually in the night shift. And he says that in the night shift, nobody sees his work. So he's actually putting his own feeling into the painting via this owl. So this is what one of the features of what Bata Sanren is doing. The next piece is depicting Boat Quay sometime before its transformation. The Chinese traditional ink technique is not very suitable to express urban scenes like Singapore. So it is not so straightforward as you see here, like as if it is quite effortlessly painted out. Because if you bound by the traditional rules, and it is very difficult to actually portray buildings for Chinese ink. So this is another example of him being able to portray Singapore scenes using somewhat traditional techniques. For example, in this piece, the foreground is using the Bai Miao technique, whereas at the back, he used ink depths. So it's a good marriage of different techniques to produce his own style. Although generally, you can still say that this is traditional. For the second gen, they are actually in a constant battle to try to come up with something new, and Mr. Chuan is one of them. This is an example of his traditional landscape paintings. This is one of his attempts to break free from his traditional roots and move into something new. In this painting, he depicts different views of the person juxtaposition together. So maybe there is some ideas of cubism, and the whole presentation is very new. Next, we move on to Mr. Yong Chong Thye, who is a calligrapher. Calligraphy is an art genre that is usually overlooked by Singapore collectors. So Yong Chong Thye is one of the few traditional calligraphers left in Singapore that is good in all the 4 Chinese calligraphy scripts. And I think personally, he is one of the best calligraphers alive today. In the international calligraphy scene, he is often invited to represent Singapore, and he has been trying very hard to input graphic elements to traditional calligraphy, because for him, he has to break out from his traditional path. So in this case, he used what we call the oracle script. The oracle script is a very ancient kind of Chinese characters. And here he used some part of the Ba Gua coming from the I Ching And he's actually writing verses from the I Ching. So he used part of the elements of the Pakwa, and then he married them together in an attempt to come up with a new calligraphic form. So for example, in this case, he tries to write calligraphy 2 times, one time in the normal black ink, where the other one is in the very light tone. So again, he's trying to come up with something different. Next, we move on to realist/impressionist artists who works on canvas. This group of artists comes from Nanyang style in the first gen, and it includes artists who does realism or semi-abstract works. The first artist we introduce in this category here is Chua Mia Tee. Chua Mia Tee is an early proponent in social realism paintings in the 50s. He was a founding member and early leader of the Equator Art Society. He told me that in the earlier days, when he was still studying in NAFA, he didn't agree with painting styles that's advocated by, for example, Chng Seok Tin or even maybe Georgette, because he felt that he wanted to paint things in the realism style. So Chng Seok Tin told him that he can paint in his own style. And soon after he left NAFA, he felt that there's no place for him to paint. And that's why he started the Equator Art Society, and he was able to garner people with similar thinking with him and form this society. He's a cultural medallion recipient. His works are very expensive, and you find that he has very good technical skills and he can paint in very high degree of realism. This is a very famous piece of Chua Mia Tee. It's an early social realism work. It's called the National Language Class, 1959. The National Art Gallery has used this piece very often, and in fact, there was a documentary film quite recently under Kelvin Tong. He made a documentary based on this piece of painting. Now, this painting is depicting people learning national language, which is Malay, early days prior to independence. Now, this painting, it may not seem as intricate or as highly skilled as his later painting shows, but you could feel the raw passion, the emotion coming right at you. There is a lot of energy in this painting. This is another very famous work called The Workers in a Canteen, painted in 1974. Now, if you compare this work with the earlier one, you would see that the technique has matured a lot, but it is still in the same social realism vein, where he is trying to portray what happened in the society and portraying the working class. By the 1980s, Chua Mia Tee sort of left the social realism kind of painting style and moved to a more serene, more just a landscape. So you can see this is a typical 1980s work of Singapore River, and it is beautiful painting, but it does not have the kind of political connotations that is found in his earlier works. This is a painting of a cup in 2012. It is very decorative, very good skills. The Equator Art Society was formed in 1956. Early members were Lim Yu Kwan, Chua Mia Tee, Lim Joon Wong, Tay Boon Pin, and so on. These members were mostly Chinese-speaking. They advocated social realism direction in their art. Social realism actually came from the Soviet Union in the 19th century, but because China turned communist in 1949, a part of Chinese-speaking artists in Singapore began to get influenced by the art movements in China, which at that time was social realism. It is through this way that they get the inspiration of social realism. The Equator Art Society grew very big at one point with a literature and music section and held yearly exhibitions. In their heydays, they had a few hundred members. By the early 1960s, there were signs that the group grew more left. I did a show for the Equator Art Society members in 2013. Many of the members denied
leftist thinking or involvement in politics. They said that they were in the society purely for art purposes. Membership declined in the 1960s, perhaps due to changing political landscapes. The 1967 show was the last show. It was closed by ISD a few hours after it was opened. After that, the society ceased to function. One second-gen artist told me that for the 1967 show catalogue, in order to get approval from ISD, the catalogues did not have words printed. However, the night before the exhibition opened, they manually stamped slogans on the catalogue through the night. Chng Seok Tin said that the 1967 show was to protest US interventions in Vietnam. So the society was deregistered in 1972. The news was published in the Gazette. The reasons of the closure were never clearly known. Some say that the government said that the society did not update the latest memberships, so they have to close. But most of the people say they don't know why. The Equator Art Society was a very important chapter in Singapore art history because most of the second generation realist painters were from the society. Big names like Chua Mia Tee, Choh Tee, Ong Kim Seng, Tong Chin Sye, and so on. Even in around 2010, discussions of this society was a taboo. It was rumored that a curator from Singapore Art Museum got a warning from ISD for putting up a show in 2007, the show being entitled Art During the Emergency. The show talked about the Equator Art Society and the roles they played during that period. The reasons for the warning was that the show hurt the feelings of people whose family members died during that time.
Next on the list is Choh Tee. Choh Tee is a very seasoned and established oil painter, and one of his important characteristics in his painting is his use of colors. You find that his color scheme is very complex, and he insists of painting every piece in plein air. And therefore, you don't really have large works because when you are out there painting in the open, there is actually a physical limitation to the size of the painting that you can do. So maybe in the earlier years, in the 80s and 90s, he could reach up to like 1.1 meters or 1.2. But recently, most of his pieces are smaller, like maybe 73 centimeters. And most of his collectors are experienced collectors.
Because you need a certain level of aesthetic appreciation skills in order to be able to understand Choh Tee's works. Therefore, sometimes Choh Tee's works don't appeal to newer collectors. Over time, when collectors learn more, they will start to like Choh Tee's works.
He has been in the art scene for a long time, since the late 70s. He has a very wide collector base. One of his critics is his painting seems to look mostly the same, but actually the devil is in the details. Now, the analogy I would like to use is like when you go to watch maybe a show like Phantom of the Opera, nobody is going after the storyline because we all already know the storyline. So what we are looking for is an experience, and also maybe comparing between certain actors, the singing style, what's the difference, and things like that. So his works may somehow maybe seems like repetitive, but actually the techniques is different. So this is the way to actually appreciate his works. So for example here, it is just a still life of mangosteen. This is actually one of the paintings that I like a lot. So you can see here, mangosteens, we sort of know them as like violet colors or maybe dark blue. But if you look at this painting closely, there are many, many hues of purple, blue. There's just so many different hues. And he can position them in a very strategic manner that the whole painting feels alive. And maybe if you take a closer look at the stems, the green color areas, you will find that there are tinge of orange or vermilion underneath it or besides it. And the brushwork, the application is all very amazing if you start looking at the details. And sometimes you just wonder how on earth he is able to apply the paint in that manner. So this is another piece where he used a lot of palette knife. In his earlier years, he used mainly brushes, but towards the last decade, he tend to move a lot to palette knife. The advantage of palette knife is that it's able to more forcefully express the kind of palette knife strokes that you find that the whole painting is more forceful. So in this case, it's just flowers and lemons, but you need to learn to know how to appreciate those strokes made by the palette knife. Choh Tee is actually most famous for his street scenes. I think one of the reasons is because most people can relate to it, so it's easier to understand. So he will go around traveling to other places in the region and paint scenes. And he has developed a technique that is very good at expressing street scenes, the old market, old buildings, that kind of things. That's why nowadays he seldom paint in Singapore, because the new Singapore landscape does not suit his painting style. And maybe the younger artists need to find another way of expression to actually express the new Singapore. Choh Tee also have nudes work. Amongst all of Choh Tee's street scene paintings, the most likable by collectors are perhaps those with depictions of stores. Could be flower stores, fruit stores, or grocery stores, where he actually have detailed renderings of colorful objects on the storefront, like the one you see here. Next on the list is Tong Chin Sye. Tong Chin Sye is more famous for his watercolor, but his oil and mixed media is also very good. So over here, I classify him under this category. Mr. Tong has very good foundation skills, and therefore his painting is very matured in terms of techniques. He is relatively unknown in the collector circle, although he is a veteran painter. In the 80s, his paintings were actually quite popular. Here you can see an example of his painting. He tends to use brighter colors as compared to Tan Choh Tee. This is another one of his Chinatown, and you can see that his color schemes can also be very complex. This is an example of what we call the mixed media. The mixed media kind of works is something that is unique to Tong Chin Sye. Over here, what happens is that he would use a canvas base, and some parts of the painting he would apply oil. But in other parts of the painting, he will use a water-based medium, for example, diluted acrylics or watercolor, or he may even apply some kind of clay-like objects to give a thickness. By doing so, he is able to achieve that kind of fluid effects on a canvas medium. The final category that we want to introduce today is what we call the New Age/others. Actually, this category contains artists which we cannot find a fit for the other three previous categories. This category exists because the second gen have more chances to travel overseas and to come into contact new art movement ideas all over the world. So they come out with something that is deviated from traditional. So the first artist to introduce here is Anthony Poon. He came from a very well-to-do family, and he had a very successful career. He was born in 1945 and passed away in 2006. Because of his background, I think he was able to get in touch with many high-profile, powerful patrons, and he received a lot of commissions for big public installations. And throughout his life, he only do one thing. All his works are centered around the concept of wave, and he made different aspects to this central concept. And his work is collected by a small pool of elites. I remember a collector who told me that when he was younger, he would wait for Anthony Poon's exhibition, and he would be one of the first to go to the exhibition to snap up his works because the works will all be taken. So this is an example of his works. And you can see that it is a kind of wavy theme. This is an example of what we call the 3D kind of wave. You can't really see from this 2D picture, but it's actually a canvas, but it is protruded out. So actually you can see the waveform in a 3D manner. And because of the lighting, and so when you move, what you see actually changes. So this is the beauty of his works. This is the same thing, but depicted in having colors. This is another example. So here is an example of a big public sculpture that he makes. This sculpture of wave you can find outside St. Regis Hotel. Next artist is a sculptor Eng Teng. He was born in 1934 and passed away in 2001. He is more famous for his sculpture. He is a very talented artist, and his paintings is also very good, but there are very few works circulating in the market at the moment. And there is a permanent Eng Teng collection in the NUS Museum. This is one of his iconic forms that is unique to him. So he has many of these mother and child kind of theme sculptures and is quite sought after by collectors. This is an example of an early painting by him, and you can see that in the late 50s or 60s, his oil painting techniques are pretty good. Next, we have Wong Kim. Now, Wong Kim started painting young, and as a teenager, his works had already been selected to the annual show by the Singapore Art Society. So during the late 50s, the art scene sort of labeled him as a child prodigy. Then in 1961, at the age of 19, he left Singapore for New York to study. So he was the first Singaporean to reach America and to foray into abstract expressionism. Just to take note, Georgette Chen was also an art student league in New York, but that was in the 1930s. So Wong Kim stayed in New York, or rather America, for a few decades. Around the 1990s, he came back to Singapore. He started to have activities in Singapore. And personally, I feel that he is one of the most talented artists amongst the second generation. Wong Kim's practice is very versatile. Some of his works are more figurative, while some of his works are more leaning towards the abstracts. And he likes very large formats. Some of his works can go as large as 3 meters. Here we see an example of an oil on canvas coming from the 90s. In this work, you find that it is a single hue work. The artist used sort of a very plain palette, mostly comprising of blues and whites. What is interesting is the shape of the sofa and the interesting composition that on the bottom right and top left, there is what we call the diagonal composition.
The diagonal composition was actually devised by Pa Shan Ren. Just like his teacher Chng Seok Tin, Wong Kim studied Pa Shan Ren's painting quite a bit.
And Wong Kim is very famous for his nudes. This work of acrylic on canvas came in the mid-2000s. It has very strong, powerful brushstrokes, and it is a tribute to de Kooning. One of his practice is the color field theory. This is a small work by Wong Kim, and it displays his skills in the color field theory. Over here, you see he sectorized the picture into different sectors and filling them up with colors that are close in the color chart. For example, you have yellow, orange, some shades of greens, and yellow ochre. And then in the center, there's a heavy tinge of blue, and then there's a nude inside. So in this case, you can see the tension, the pulls and pulls between each sectors. The lotus has always been a very popular subject in Wong Kim's body of works. Why does Wong Kim like lotuses? This is because lotus can exist in infinite shapes and sizes and forms. So the artist is 100% free to play around with the lotus as a subject matter. This is another lotus but executed with ink on paper. So it is using somewhat like a Chinese medium but expressed in a very Western way. And recently, in the last maybe 5 years, he has forayed into this, what we call the meat series. The meat provided an opportunity, like lotus, for him to manipulate the form and color freely. For example, the red hue, and it also can exist in different shapes and sizes and different color schemes. So there is a high degree of freedom. So in this painting, you see there's this green band. It's actually meaning the door of the butcher store, and then on the left is the outside, on the right is the inside. So it's an interesting composition. Some people find the meat series a bit grotesque, but actually to Wong Kim, the meat is just another expression of forms and colors. The next artist we want to introduce is Tan Swie Hian. Tan Swie Hian started off as a poet in the 1960s. As a very young person, he is already highly regarded in the literati circle. And already in the 60s, a leading figure in the literati scene. And he has been very influential since. I think he is extremely talented and out of his contemporaries class. And he called himself a multidiscipline artist because he can produce works in terms of literature as a poet or writing short essays, and he could compose paintings, and he even collaborated with artists of other disciplines like writing a calligraphy together with a symphonic orchestra and things like that. His works showed deep philosophical backgrounds and has mind-blowing power to move people. He is very well decorated in Singapore and overseas, so he got lots of prizes from all over the world. And he is the first living artist in Singapore to have his own private museum while he's alive. So here is an example of his ink work in the 80s. And this 1980 ink work is way ahead of his times. In this work, he has strong effects of black and white and deep philosophical interpretations. In order to show what I meant by deep philosophical things inside his painting, I will now introduce to you this body of work which we call the 10 Ox series. The 10 Ox is a theme that comes out from ancient times in the Buddhist Zen traditions. It is actually detailing the process of attaining enlightenment in the Zen traditions. These 10 compositions are not only beautiful, but incorporated many novel ways of expressions. For example, in these 10 pieces, he actually has his own footprints on the painting. So the first piece in this series is The Searching of the Ox. Next is Discovering of the Footprints. So this subject matter has already been attempted by many artists back in the past. So actually, to attempt this subject matter, you are actually wrestling with past masters. And there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of creative elements that he put inside. For example, in this piece, if you look at the rock carefully, then you will see the head of the ox. So the ox is actually embedded, not so straightforward in the painting, and it is actually signifies in order to find the truth, it is not so straightforward. I first saw this group of paintings displayed in Tan Swie Hian's private museum. It was displayed there in a row, 10 pieces, and it was an amazing sight and mind-blowing. There's a sense of grandeur. And then when I looked deeper into the philosophical meaning of these 10 ox, I was just swayed away. When you look at Tan Swie Hian's painting, Not only you must look at the traditional aesthetic view, you cannot divorce it from his philosophical meaning. In fact, every piece of his work has very deep philosophical meaning. I show you subsequently other pieces in the series. Now, for the number 6 piece.
Tan Swie Hian has a strange habit of working. He sleeps in the day and will go to his studio in Telok Kurau Studios at night. Then he will meditate. He is a devout Buddhist. Through his meditation, he would explore his inner beings and ideas would form. He would then write down his thoughts into some notebooks. Slowly over time, the ideas will crystallize into an artwork. Thus, his artworks are often accompanied with a lot of thinking. Also, over the years, he wrote many notebooks. I think he donated some of them to the National Library.
And the number 7, this is the ox transcented. You can see that in terms of techniques, how he actually played with the wash and to achieve the effects that he wanted. Next is both ox and self-transcented. Reaching the source. And then intro to the world. Basically, it means after you have attained enlightenment, you must go back to the world to save other people.
Chng Seok Tin passed away just last year. He was one of the first few local artists to have adopted printmaking as a primary medium. He was a multidisciplinary artist who was also well known for her sculptures and mixed media work in addition to printmaking. After completing a diploma in Western painting from NAFA and having served as a Chinese teacher in TKGS, he left for St. Martin's School of Art in London for a foundation studies program in art. He received a few awards to fund her overseas education. From 1980 till 1985, he remained abroad to continue her adventure with printmaking. In 1988, Chng Seok Tin lost 90% of her vision after an accident, unfortunately. Yet her visual impairment did not stop her from pursuing her artistic endeavors. She taught as an art lecturer in various Singapore institutions. She was conferred the Cultural Medallion in 2005 in recognition of her relentless spirit and contributions to the arts. Seok Tin's work reflect unorthodox pictorial styles marked by strong experimental spirit and creativity. Due to her interest in Zhuangzi and various philosophical texts, the theme of existentialism resonates strongly in her oeuvre, dramatizing man's materialistic ambitions and struggles for enlightenment or freedom. This piece, titled Contrast, depicts the interconnectivity between two juxtaposing spheres that existed almost as each other's mirror image, bound by a single running thread. Each sphere is self-contained, yet only could be complete in the presence of the other. During the few years in the States, Seok Tin wandered back to nature for creative inspiration. She created a series of prints that portrays water as a source of life. Intense Flow is one such work. Although small in size, it captures the robust movement of water and atmospheric streams of light that descend upon the rocks and currents in essence. After the loss of eyesight, the artist made adjustments to her mode of production so that she could work around her disability. For example, when it became increasingly impossible for her to carry on in lithography and woodcut, she relied more on dry point method instead. Subsequently, her primary production transited from printmaking to mixed media works and sculptures, which she could still explore through tactile instincts.
So again, here there's some questions to help you recap on the contents that we have covered.